Hello and welcome to TikTok Tour. Today we're learning about how to determine the max or min of a quadratic function by completing the square. This method allows us to change from standard form of the equation of a quadratic function or parabola into vertex form of the equation, which will then allow us to easily determine the vertex and therefore the max or min value. Here we have an example of an equation. And if you haven't seen this notation before with f of x, don't worry, the method stays the same. It's just a different notation for when we've seen y equals earlier. So don't worry about that. It doesn't take away from the explanation. Okay, so for this example, what we first need to do is we need to isolate the x squared term by factoring out the coefficient, -2. But we only need to do this for the first two terms of the equation. So we'll factor out the -2 and we'll write down what we have left over afterwards. So we have x squared, and the 12 divided by -2 gives us -6x. And the plus 32 stays on the outside. What we then need to do is find the third term of our perfect square trinomial that we want to have inside the brackets right here. But as I said, we need the third term for it to be a trinomial, and it needs to be a perfect square so that in the end we have an equation that has x plus or minus some value that's squared. Once we factored whatever this trinomial turns out to be, and that will help us get to vertex form of the equation because that's what that usually looks like. Okay, so how do we get to that? In order to do that, we'll take a bit of a detour here, and let's take a look at what a perfect square trinomial is. So here's an example, x squared minus 8x plus 16. And the reason why it's a perfect square trinomial is because I can take the -8, find two numbers that add to it, and find two numbers that multiply to equal to 16. And that pair would be -4, -4. And what's special is that that's the same number repeated. So then we have x minus 4 squared. That's the kind of trinomial we want to have so that when it factors, we end up with something like this in this form as mentioned earlier. So in order to find what that would be, we're going to take a look at the connection here. So when you go from -8 to -4, because that middle term is in essence what we already have in our example that we're working on, and we can take that, divide it by 2 to get to our factor, and then we can take that and square it to get to the third term. So in general then, what we are doing is we're always taking our b value, dividing it by 2 and squaring it, and that will end off with the c value. So that's our general method that we're going to then use over here. So we're going to take the -6, divide it by 2 and square it. So we get -3 squared, which is 9. So because we're squaring it, we know that that third term must be positive in our perfect square trinomial. So let's add that in. Change colors to emphasize this. So we have plus and -9. If I had just left it with the +9 here, what would happen is it would get me to that perfect square trinomial, but then I've changed the equation altogether and I make a whole new function. That's not what I want. So by also subtracting 9, what I'm doing is adding 0 in essence to the equation, which doesn't change the graph of it or the function overall, but it does help me change the way the equation looks and helps me manipulate that easier. So continuing on then, if I take a look here, I have the 3 terms of my perfect square trinomial, but I also have the -9 inside the brackets and I don't really want that there. So I'm going to continue on and bring that outside of the brackets by multiplying by the -2. So this applies to the value that you're pulling outside of the brackets. So -9 times -2 is +18. We also have the +32 already outside of the brackets. Now let's start simplifying and factoring. The x squared minus 6x plus 9 can now be factored easily. Two numbers that multiply to equal to -6 and multiply to equal to +9. Let's show that work on the side just to make it clear. So to multiply to +9, add to +6, or -6, sorry, would be -3 and -3. And that seems to work in both cases, so that's great. So we can write down x minus 3 squared, and then 18 plus 32 is 50. So now we have the equation in vertex form. And the vertex is 350. We can also see that because we know the vertex, we now know that the max value is the y value, which is 50, and we also know the axis of symmetry, which is x equals to 3. All right, and that is completing the square to determine the max or min of a quadratic function or a parabola. If you liked the video, then please feel free to like, share, and subscribe to my channel, Tic Tac Tour. Hope this helped.